Astrology is the myths of the stars and planets, telling the themes and plots of our lives. These stories come to us daily through our satellite, the Moon. She is constantly spinning astro news. Hi, I'm Merrylin Leblanc with Moonwise. Today we begin a series of shows on Pluto generations. Those are groups of people born with the planet Pluto in the same zodiac sign. Joining me in this series is Daniel Fiverson. Welcome, Daniel.
Oh, always great to be here, Merrylin.
Great to have you here, Daniel. We've decided, you and I, to address each Pluto generation living, beginning with the largest, oldest group, Cancer. I say largest, oldest, because there are, I suspect, a few individuals still living who were born in 1912 or earlier, being 106 or older, who have Pluto in Gemini. On other series, we are going to go through the other signs, starting with Cancer, going to Leo, and then Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Capricorn, where we are now, people born with Pluto in Capricorn. And before we get into talking about people born while Pluto was last in Cancer, let's first talk about Pluto in general and as it applies to generations. So, Daniel, Pluto.
All right, Pluto. It's such a perfect topic with all the Scorpio energy that's in the world right now. I think this is probably how we came to it. In evolutionary astrology, EA, Pluto correlates directly to the soul. It is that immutable part of us that exists outside of time and space. If we look at it from our perspective down here on the planet, Pluto correlates to what came before. It's what we have brought with us from the past. It's our previous identity associations. And it's the desires. It's our deepest subconscious desires, which often we're not even aware of what they are or what the source of the desire is all about. It's totally chthonic. It's totally below the surface. It is our underworld. It's our subconscious.
Whoa. Okay. You know, in the common keyword books on astrology, Pluto is the planet of transformation, evolution, revolution, etc. And based on, what you're saying about the soul and where we've been, and then putting that together with the thought of evolution, it's like where the soul might need to continue an evolutionary path. That's how I look at it. So the energies of the sign feed the desire for change.
Yes, there's no question that when we become stagnant, the need to change appears. The circumstances of the relationship show up, which facilitate it. So we bring in a core set of lessons that we've already been working on. Jeff Green postulated that there are 8 primary lifetimes in every cycle of lessons, which correlate to the phases of the moon. It doesn't mean that there's only 8 lifetimes in each one of those cycles, but Pluto represents the cycle of lessons in the current cycle that we're in. I think I've said in other broadcasts that the relationship between Mars and Pluto, higher octave and lower octave of each other, really show us where we are in that cycle of lessons. But Pluto in the chart by sign, house, and aspect will describe exactly what we've brought with us, that are the lessons that we have been working in the past, perhaps where we have met our greatest challenges, and also where our gifts are. We come in with 2 suitcases, one that's so heavy it drags on the floor and the other that's so light we don't even know we're carrying it. One is our lessons, the other are the gifts and the fruitions that we have accomplished. All that's contained in Pluto.
So Pluto having to do with our desire, nature, and soul coming in. People who were born when Pluto was in Cancer last which began back in 1912. It went in and out of Cancer, back and forth, and then by 1914 it was solidly in Cancer until 1937 to 36, where it went 37 to 39, where it went back and forth in and out of it again. So this is a long period of time, longer than we're experiencing right now with Cancer's transits through the zodiac, where it was like 27 years in that sign. What do you see as the desires that generation of people, and some of them may be listening to this show today?
Sure. Well, Cancer is ruled by the moon. Anybody who's listening today has learned an awful lot about the moon in the past number of years since Moonwise has been on the air. The moon's about our security. The moon is where we feel safe. It's our sanctuary, if you would. The moon is where where we go to in order to find our sense of security, our sense of familiarity. It's our family. It's what we're used to. It's what we're accustomed to. It's human nature to hold on to what is known, even when we know that it doesn't work. We're in a relationship or a job, and it stopped working some time ago, but we hold on to it because that's our nature. What's known, even though it's filled with flaws and problems and challenges, is safer and than the unknown, than change. Mm-hmm. So we will stay in the familiar. That's the nature of the moon, and that's the nature of Cancer is to find that security.
Well, but yet what I say on Moonwise, especially when I address the lunation cycles, is that I feel that they are meant to help us evolve, to help us change. And the moon is the body in space that changes the most of all the bodies that we astrologers address.
Right.
And one of the things about the sign of Cancer in terms of evolving and stuff, when you think about being born into a family, there is this whole drive within a family to survive.
Right.
Survival is a big thing, but there's, of course, security is a part of that. But also to survive as an individual. There's this striving that to identify oneself beyond the definition of that family that one comes into.
Right.
So that I also look at Cancer as an individuating process as well. It's a kind of the initial thrust of individuation.
It's the beginning. It's the cardinal energy of water. It's where we recognize that we're an emotional being. And as we move actually through the houses and signs, Cancer and the fourth house is where we see ourselves for the first time. It's our self-image. It's our ego. And it is truly the beginning of that individuation. It's still an internal process. We're not engaged in a relationship. We're not even out in the world. We're in ourselves. Mm-hmm. When we move, into the fifth house in Leo, that's when that ego gets out in the world. Yeah. But the Cancer is that self-image, and it's that self-understanding.
So, when Pluto comes along, and what influence do you see when you're looking at Pluto in Cancer in terms of security and in terms of survival?
Well, I think, just to jump back a notch or two, the overwhelming characteristic of the Pluto in Cancer generation is gender assignment. Men were men, women were women. Men were Marlboro men, women were Betty Crocker. Pretty much. Not everybody. We can't paint everybody with the same brush, clearly. But what those gender roles were held pretty firm, and I think that we're seeing that today in because this is the old guard. These are the people who want to hold on to the way that things are, to the way that things have been in the past, to what's familiar, to what's known, to what's, quote, safe, from their perspective. And we have to also understand that all these archetypes are a polarity. None of these signs, these zodiac signs, exist singly, as an isolated dynamic. They're part of a polarity, and the polarity here is Capricorn. This is father and mother, fourth house and 10th house, and we're dealing with all the issues of. What is it, me versus the world? Women stayed home. The Pluto and Cancer women did not go out and have careers. The men
This was a Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet kind of.
Right.
It kind of reached that epitome in the 50s, I guess, in terms of television shows and the images of family.
They stayed home. They took care of the house. They raised the children. They did all the domestic. All the domestic work, and men.
So there was an identity model being presented during that generation.
Right. Your gender determined who you were in the world. Again, it's not to say that there weren't male nurses and men working as secretaries.
Very rare.
Right. Well, the big difference, I think, was World War II. Because all the men went off to war. That's 39 is an interesting.
Well, that was a transit,
exactly,
because it was going in and out of into Leo, back into Cancer, back and forth. The people who have Cancer and Pluto in Cancer would be in their late 70s right now and older. Those people that are still alive, so they're the parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and for some even great-great-grandparents that we have today. They're some of the white-haired generation that we see here in Santa Fe who are quite it's interesting because the ones I see to the things that I involve myself in are not necessarily the Ozzie and Harriet kind of model. Right. They're more progressive. And one of the things about the end of this sign is, and even people born with this sign, in terms going back to the survival image, is that many of them were the leaders and the influencers of the hippie generation. And many of them were Cancer, but you also had young Leos involved in that as well.
They were the parents who nurtured the hippie generation, who gave the hippie generation their freedom, who gave them that space.
And that's the individuation process right there. It's like recognizing that the family should be the place that nurtures the individual to be expressive.
Right.
But, one of the things we haven't talked about, I'm going to come back to this. I'm looking at the time, and it's time for the Moon Minute. You're listening to Moonwise here on KSFR 101.1 FM. I'm Merrylin Leblanc with my guest, Daniel Fiverson. Don't forget that you can always listen to podcasts of this show on our website, ksfr.org, where you can also make contributions to support this public radio station. Here's the Moon Minute. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to Moonwise. I'm Merrylin LeBlanc with my guest, Daniel Fiverson. Today we are doing the first of a series of Moonwise shows about Pluto generations, the people born with Pluto in particular signs. And Pluto spends a great deal of time in a sign, anywhere from about 10 to almost 30 years, because it doesn't have a balanced revolution around the sun. It spends long periods in some signs and short in others. And for the sign that we started with, Cancer, it spent 27 years in Cancer back in the beginning of the 20th century, and through half of that century, almost, not quite really. So anyway, as we were talking earlier in the show about some of the issues in Cancer that have to do with security and survival, one of the things that we didn't talk about was that Pluto challenges us to change our views about certain issues, maybe transform them, or at least maybe bring them to another level of consciousness on a bigger scope. And so one of the major challenges for the Pluto in Cancer generations were world wars.
Mm-hmm.
It was during the time that Pluto was in Cancer that we had World War I and World War II. And, of course, wars threaten our survival.
Right.
So this was very extreme, and why, we had in this country, once we decided to be involved in wars, we established even a draft and got rid of it later.
It's an interesting thing that you bring up, because cancer can really become nationalism. Family, our country becomes the big family. It can be patriotism, or it can be nationalism, and the kind of nationalist energy that we're actually seeing in the world right now, that's in our country right now, that's not very pleasant to observe. There's a separateness to it. The moon has two cycles: animation and withdrawal. We go through emotionally. We go through those same cycles, and I think we go through those cycles also. It's part of the body politic. The moon in the mundane chart, in a country's chart, is also the people. So, we go through cycles of wanting to withdraw and wanting to, be out there and be active and animated. And I think that this is also part of the Pluto Cancer dynamic. All these archetypes of light and shadow. If we look at the people who were born during this period from roughly 1912 to 1939, we had both Bobby and John Kennedy. We had Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez, Sandra Day O'Connor, Gloria Steinem. People who took their gender roles, and from my perspective, took them and made them into an ideal expression of what what it was to be a woman. If you look at the feminists who emerged in the 60s, who were born in the late 20s and early 30s, who emerged with a whole new vision of what it meant to be feminine in our society. The men, I don't know that the men I have, I don't know that I can support my gender with as much, hope, because what we're seeing, unfortunately, through the Pluto and Cancer generation is really with the final, final throes of the patriarchy. Again, we did have role models who, but they're gone.
Well, but you just reframe a little bit of what you just said is like if Cancer, the archetype would be the female, the woman, and that would be the light of it, and the shadow of it would be the male or the female. That's one way of looking. One way of looking at it. And one of the things that's really interesting is at the beginning, not about 5 years or so, 7 years in, Pluto, while Pluto was in Cancer in 1919, that we had the 19th Amendment for women to be able to vote.
Right.
And you might say that the war, brought out the masculine more in terms of the patriarchy, I should say, not the masculine so much, the patriarchy. And so there was kind of this, I see through that generation, this kind of vying about, well, wait a minute, this is, the dynamic is changing. And so how do we change these roles? And when we're doing this on a generational level, it doesn't happen quickly.
Right.
And so you have this kind of, father knows best, and yet, women went to the factories, and what was that, Sally the riveter?
Right. Sally the riveter, right.
and so you had this kind of dynamic going on back and forth throughout.
Well, in EA, in evolutionary astrology, we also look at what's called a polarity point. Every planet has its polarity point. The Pluto polarity point, if Pluto represents, and Pluto in the chart by sign, house, and aspect represents the lessons that we've been working on and we've brought with us. Its polarity point in Capricorn represents where the soul is intending to go. It's a probable path forward. Probable because we make choices. And nothing is set in stone. It's set in the choices that we make in our consciousness. And that's Capricorn. And Capricorn is about responsibility. So it really is about, I think women, through the last 100 years leading up to the 20th century, felt, except maybe for the pioneer woman, and there's always exceptions, where their place was in the home, and their place was, to be quiet, and the men retired to the parlor to smoke cigars after dinner. There was
women had to take care of the children.
Right. They lived separate lives to a great degree. And I think that what happened with the Pluto and Cancer was there was more of a sense of a family, and there was more of a realization that, especially coming through 2 world wars, that women had to take more responsibility in terms of being more than just the mother. Or they had to be the great mother. They had to be the mother on a much broader scale, if you would. They had to recognize that the finances were important to them. That they couldn't just leave everything to the husband.
You needed money to put food on the table.
Right. So they had to get involved. They would go out and go to work. My mother was actually was one of those women who was that kind of role model. I grew up with a working mother.
Well, me too.
Yeah, she, when I went off to kindergarten, she went to work, and she actually started her own business. So, I had the experience of seeing, a woman who wasn't just Betty Crocker. She was not Betty Crocker in a lot of ways. She wasn't the world's best cook either. But, she was an important role model to her, that individuating energy that you're talking about, where she recognized that her role, she redefined for herself what it meant to be a woman. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of what we saw happening through the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. Well, when you bring up the polarity point of Capricorn, and I know we didn't want to get into other generations so much, but just the fact that and people born in Capricorn are still children today. They're not adults yet,
right.
But with Pluto in Capricorn, but still it's a kind of an interesting contrast when these young people become adults, to look at them versus the women of the Pluto and Cancer generation that we've just been talking about.
Yeah,
they're going to be different in some unusual way.
I think it's an interesting dichotomy, because we're seeing both sides of the spectrum. We're seeing, the oldest people on the planet, and we're seeing the youngest people on the planet, and there's a direct correlation between the two somehow. They mesh. They're each, the other half of, one half of the other.
You have a granddaughter that's.
I have a granddaughter who's Pluto.
You can look
Capricorn.
at her and think of your mother.
Right.
Different generations. Right. All right. Well, we're winding down here, and I'm not sure if we've covered everything we wanted to cover about the people with Pluto and Cancer. Is there other elements of lightness versus shadow that you might think of in that generation?
Just in terms of Pluto in general, there's 2 ways that Pluto can work. Actually, there's 4 ways that it can work, but basically it's 2 groups of dynamics. Pluto is the engine, the actual engine of the evolution that you described. That when we become stagnant, we will be encouraged, I guess is the word I want to use, to grow, to move past where we're stuck. That's Pluto's role. And Pluto will give us subtle hints, and it can happen gradually. We can proactively change our lives by recognizing the signposts, on the road as we move through life. And we can make the changes we need to make. Most often, we don't do it until we get much older, because we have to have enough experience, enough direct emotional experience, which again is the moon. Until we experience something emotionally, we don't know it. And that's what Pluto, which is Scorpio, which is the second of the water triad, brings that direct emotional experience to the moon. And that's how we change. But those experiences will intensify over time until the change occurs. It's not like it's going to go away. It's never going to go away. It's a question of, do you hear me now?
Yeah. Well, one of the other, just by way of examples that I see looking back at that generation is that in terms of security and survival, this was a period of time in which what's been come to be known as the American dream, that every family has a home, a house. Right. That's when that whole element developed to the point at the end of the period that Pluto was in Cancer, we even began to see the establishment of suburbs, and there are other takes on all of that because everything has its drawback. Even the way that we treat land and real estate has its shadow side too. And we could look at the financial market, and for an example, and see the downsides there with some of the things that have happened in the 21st century, at the beginning of this century here in this country.
But fascism was definitely, the fascism of the 30s was definitely a product of Pluto and Cancer. That nationalism that says that my country is better than your country, and what I believe is more important than what you believe, and I have the right to, to create the governance that will enforce that.
Yeah, but those elements had their sources farther back. If we could do research, like the last time that Pluto was in Cancer was in the 1660s, and you could look then 250 years before that, for the time before that, and you can probably, in terms of ideologies, overall ideologies that are governing large groups of people, we might be able to trace that more to its elemental root. Well, Daniel, thank you for being my guest once again here on Moonwise. We will hopefully bring you a show about Pluto in Leo generation next month, so stay tuned, keep listening, and enjoy yourselves out there. You're listening to KSFR, White Rock, Santa Fe Public Radio, and stay tuned for Climate One.